Hello, welcome to Rethinking the Six Wives of Henry VIII. In this episode, we are going to be discussing Anne of Cleves. So if you don't know who Anne of Cleves was, she was the fourth wife of Henry VIII, and she was also the wife to survive not only Henry, but all of his wives. So what legacy has been left of Anne? Well, we tend to think of Anne as, quite sadly, the discarded bride. They were married for a very short time and Henry didn't really want to go into the match and wanted to very swiftly come out of it. But we also tend to think of her as the ugly one, the Flanders mare. Now, this stems from Henry. When Henry first met Anne, it was a very tricky situation because Henry had dressed up to meet his new bride, and he had dressed up in secret, he had dressed up in costume, and he loved the idea of chivalry. And the idea would be that regardless of the fact that he's in fancy dress, Anne, his bride, should realise that this is the king. But she didn't. And Henry was offended, and let's say they didn't get off to the right foot. So what are the legacies that I believe Anne deserves? Firstly, that she always behaved like a queen. Secondly, that she was a kind, caring woman, popular with her people. Thirdly, that she was determined to get the best that life threw at her. And fourthly, that she was a proud woman. So let's start with the first one. Always behaved like a queen, because I think she did. Anne was described as virtuous and noble, and it was Thomas Cromwell himself who said she's beautiful in face and body. The way that she spoke to people, her kind and caring nature, not only made her popular, but just made her a great queen. And this was something that was really important to her from day one. She wanted to get it right. And so when she was on the boat to England, she asked about Henry. She wanted to learn about him, the things that he enjoyed, the games that he liked to play. She asked about English etiquette and poise and how that she should conduct herself at court. Whenever she had to make speeches, she would rehearse them again and again to make sure that they were word perfect. And even after the marriage, when she is no longer Henry's wife, she still behaved like a real queen. She was invited to dine with Henry and Catherine Howard, his new bride, one evening, and they ended up dining, and Anne and Catherine ended up dancing together, and it was lovely. After the fall of Catherine Howard, both Anne and her brother hoped for a reconciliation, but of course it didn't come round. Despite this, though, Anne always saw herself as the true queen. She never publicly said it because she knew what had happened to Catherine of Aragon, her circumstances getting worse and worse, but Catherine still maintaining that she was his wife and queen. And so Anne just sat back, let the world around her carry on, but her herself, whenever she was around people, whether that be the public or courtiers, she always behaved like a queen. The next legacy I think Anne deserves to be remembered for is that she was a kind and caring woman and really loved by the public, because she was. Anne had a way of charming crowds. Her demureness, her virtuousness, her kindness just radiated out through her and people loved her. She had this element of regal demureness that people adhered to. And despite the fact that Anne was Catholic, she was popular with all people, including reformists. I feel like Anne is a bit like a swan. Underneath, inside, she's pedalling away, her feet are flapping, she's flapping. It's a bit more complicated. But on the outside, she just has this calm and serenity that she shows to everybody else. The imperial ambassador said, "Everybody has nothing but good to say of the Duchess." And after the divorce, the annulment, there was public sympathy for Anne because the people loved her. And even when Anne was coming to the end of her life, she was still worried about the people. So she made some monetary amounts to go to her household, her ladies who served her, and also the people that resided in the areas of her favourite palaces, Bletchley and Hever, despite the fact that Anne didn't have as much money as she did during the reign of Henry. Her money and her income changed considerably. Her thoughts at her last moments were making sure that the people around her were okay. The next legacy that I believe Anne deserves to be remembered for is that she was determined to get the best out of life. Now, it was a triumphant moment when Anne married Henry, not just for her, but for her brother as well. And Anne really did try to make it work. As I said previously, she tried to learn about what Henry liked and English etiquette and how to address herself in an English court. But she also changed her exterior too. Gone were her dresses from her country and in were the English dresses. So she wore an English dress and a fine French hood. The French fashion was Henry's favourite, as we know from Anne Boleyn. And so that's what Anne did. But of course, you can't just change your looks and hope that marriage will be okay. It doesn't work. If someone doesn't love you, it's not going to work. And sadly, Henry didn't love Anne. When Anne first learned about the idea of annulment, that Henry wanted to end their marriage, she was really visibly upset because for her, she'd tried really hard and it was a big deal, this marriage. She hadn't been married to him very long and she felt humiliated, essentially. However, Anne did have a shrewd legal brain and she asked to see the evidence in which Henry was putting forward in order to obtain this annulment. On the 26th of June, she summoned her brother's ambassador to come to her. And they had a conversation. And the conversation was talking about the annulment. And Anne said she knew what had happened to Catherine of Aragon. In other words, that Catherine had been replaced by one of her own ladies. And there was already gossip at court about Henry and young Catherine Howard. So Anne knew what was coming. She was also terrified about what could happen to her. The prospect of what happened to Anne Boleyn and the execution of Anne Boleyn was what terrified Anne. Throughout all this, the comings, the goings, the letters, the discussions, there was times in which Anne had a legal head on and she was thinking really clearly. There were other times where she was crying, she was wailing, there was one time where she even supposedly fainted. But Anne managed to put all these emotional effects aside and just concentrate on getting the best at this situation that she could. When she found out that she was going to be treated fairly in this situation by Henry, she went, okay, and she wrote a letter to Henry to say, okay, not obviously those words, but she did write to Henry to, okie dokie, we can go ahead. Henry was quite surprised by this, happily surprised I must add, because of course the last time he tried to get a divorce from one of his wives was his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon had fought tooth and nail and even had to have a trial with Cardinal Wolsey, Cardinal Campeggio and the Pope in the picture. But here was Anne of Cleves saying, okay, she had learnt from Catherine and possibly her mistakes, because after all, Catherine's life ended certainly not in a way to befit her station. What could Anne achieve if she was willing and showed willingness to the divorce? It turns out quite a lot. Because of her willingness, Henry was very generous with Anne. He gifted her a very good income, lots of beautiful jewels. He gifted her the use of various palaces, including Hever Castle, the childhood home of Anne Boleyn. He also got her a household of staff as well. Anne did put in some requests herself, one of which was that the Lady Elizabeth could visit her, Lady Elizabeth being the daughter of Henry VIII with his second wife Anne Boleyn. Anne had grown quite close to Elizabeth and she found her a really charming little girl, and so that wish was granted by Henry. But Anne didn't agree to everything, including writing to her brother, but we'll get to that in a minute. On the 11th of July, Anne wrote a letter to Henry. She accepted the terms, and there we have it. And she signed it, humble sister and servant, because that's what she was now. She was no longer his wife, queen consort. She was his sister, that was the title that she had, and his servant. And then days later, on the 21st of July, she sent another letter, but this time she sent her wedding ring with it. In the letter she said about the ring, it might be broken into pieces as a thing which knew no force or value. It's quite a sad way to end the marriage, really, but through Anne's legal brain, putting aside her emotional elements, she was able to get the best out of this situation. And finally, the last legacy I believe Anne deserves to be known for is that she's a really proud woman. As I previously said, that the divorce hurt Anne. Anne had tried really hard. This was a good marriage for her and her family. Henry was notorious. Not many people wanted to marry him, that's true, but it was still a good match. And with it being over so quickly, Anne felt humiliated, and she felt like she had brought shame not on herself but also on her family. Her brother said that he understood. Henry, by this point, had a reputation. He'd banished and humiliated one wife, executed another, and the next one had died. And so Henry wasn't exactly a match in the marriage market. Now, Anne did have to stay in England for two reasons, really. First of all, Henry needed the ability to control her. I mean, after all, she wasn't English born and bred, and similar to Catherine of Aragon, he didn't want the family to kind of gang up on him, political alliances coming together, and him risking everything. So he had to have her here. Didn't want to annoy her brother too much. But even if she could go back, she wouldn't. Her pride wouldn't let her. She felt shame, she felt humiliated, and she was too proud to go back. After all, if she did go back, she would be just seen as the discarded bride and penniless. And so she lived the rest of her life out in England. Now, she didn't pass away until the reign of Mary I in 1557. And so she outlived all the other wives. But her pride made her stay. Her pride made her the queen of the people for all that time. But I think what was really happening underneath is summed up very well in something that she wrote to her brother. And that, of course, is England, and we are strangers. So the next time you think of Anne of Cleves, don't think of her as the discarded bride or the Flanders mare. Let's think of her as a woman who always behaved like a queen, a proud, kind and popular woman with her public, who was clever enough to get the best out of life. I hope you have enjoyed this episode on Anne of Cleves. If you have, please give me a big thumbs up. Chat to me in the comments all things Anne of Cleves, and I shall see you soon for the next video. Bye for now.